The day Eleanor Voss was sold like livestock to a stranger, she wore her mother's wedding dress, the only thing her father hadn't pawned for whiskey. The entire town of Dry Creek gathered not to celebrate, but to watch her final humiliation. They whispered behind gloved hands about the mysterious rancher who'd paid her father's debts, wondering what kind of man buys a broken woman. Eleanor stood at that altar with bruises hidden beneath lace sleeves, waiting for her new prison to begin. She had no idea the silent man beside her had been waiting 15 years for this moment, or that he'd built an entire life in the mountains just for her. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Eleanor's journey travels. The church smelled like dust and judgment. Eleanor kept her eyes down, studying the warped floorboards beneath her feet. Someone had tried to scrub years of dirt from the wood, but Montana grime didn't surrender easily. Nothing in Dry Creek did. The town held on to its grudges, its gossip, its cruelty, with the same stubborn grip it used on everything else. She could feel them watching. 73 people crammed into pews meant for 50, their necks craning, their mouths moving behind fans and handkerchiefs. Mrs. Kelsey in the third row, the mill workers from the east side, the shopkeeper's wife who'd once spit at Eleanor's feet for asking about day-old bread. They'd come for the spectacle. Harrison Voss's daughter, finally off his hands, sold to some rancher from the mountains nobody had ever seen before. The whole arrangement reeked of desperation and shame, and the good people of Dry Creek wouldn't miss it for the world. Eleanor's dress hung wrong, her mother's wedding gown, pulled from a trunk that hadn't been opened in 12 years. The silk had yellowed in places, and moths had gotten to the hem, but her father had insisted. "You'll wear what you're given and be grateful," he'd said that morning, his breath sour with last night's whiskey. "Man's paying good money for damaged goods. Least you can do is look like you're worth something." Damaged goods. The words had stopped hurting years ago. Eleanor had learned to let them slide off, the way water rolled off oilcloth. She'd learned a lot of things in 23 years under her father's roof: how to move silently through a house, how to make herself small, how to disappear into walls and corners when his voice started rising, how to survive. The dress pulled tight across her shoulders. She'd cinched the corset herself that morning, fingers shaking, knowing this was the last time she'd wake up in that narrow room with the broken window latch. The last time she'd hear her father's boots on the stairs, wondering if today would be worse than yesterday. A different prison waited now. Reverend Michaels cleared his throat. He was a thin man with a face like a dried apple, and he'd baptized Eleanor when she was 6 days old. He'd also watched her father drag her from church by her hair when she was 14, and he'd done nothing. Nobody in Dry Creek ever did. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying across the silent church. Eleanor's hands trembled. She clasped them together, trying to stop the shaking. She could feel the bruises on her wrists, still tender beneath the lace. Her father had gripped her hard last night, dragging her close, his face inches from hers. "You'll do exactly as you're told tomorrow. You'll say the words. You'll smile if he wants you to smile. You understand me, girl? This deal falls through, and I'll—" She'd understood. She always understood. Beside her, the man she was about to marry stood perfectly still. Caleb Mercer. She'd seen him exactly twice before today. Once, 3 weeks ago, when he'd come to the house and spoken with her father in low voices behind closed doors. She'd caught only glimpses: tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair, a face that gave away nothing. The second time was yesterday, at the courthouse, signing papers she wasn't allowed to read. He hadn't looked at her either time, hadn't spoken to her, had treated the entire arrangement like a business transaction at the feed store. Efficient, impersonal, final. Eleanor didn't know what he'd paid her father, didn't know what debts he'd cleared or what promises had been made. She only knew that when Caleb Mercer rode back to whatever ranch he'd come from, she'd be going with him. As property, as payment, as something bought and owned. "We are gathered here today," Reverend Michaels continued, "to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Holy? Eleanor almost laughed. There was nothing holy happening in this church. This was a transaction, a transfer of ownership. Her father got his debts cleared and his useless daughter removed from his household. Caleb Mercer got, what, a cook? A maid? A woman too broken to run? Woman? She still didn't know. Didn't know why a man who'd never met her would pay Harrison Voss's gambling debts and buy himself a wife in the process. The rumors in town had been vicious. He was a monster. He was a hermit who'd gone strange in the mountains. He was desperate, unable to find a woman willing to marry him through normal means. Eleanor didn't care about the reasons anymore. She'd stopped caring about a lot of things. If anyone objects to this union, the Reverend said, performing his duty with mechanical precision, speak now or forever hold your peace. Silence. Of course there was silence. Who would object? Who in this town had ever stood up for Eleanor Voss? She could collapse right here on these floorboards, and they'd step over her body to get to the church supper afterward. Very well. The Reverend turned to Caleb. Do you, Caleb James Mercer, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do. His voice was quiet but clear, deep, steady. Eleanor had heard men make promises before. Her father promised every Sunday he'd stop drinking, promised he'd be better, promised her mother's memory meant something to him. Promises were just words men used before they broke you. The Reverend turned to her. Do you, Eleanor Marie Voss, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Eleanor's throat closed. This was it. The moment everything changed, the moment she stepped from one cage into another. She could say no, could refuse, could make a scene right here in front of everyone. And then what? Go back to her father's house? Go back to the locked doors and the cruel words and the nights wondering if this time he'd go too far? She opened her mouth. I do. Her voice barely carried past the first pew, but it was enough. By the power vested in me, Reverend Michael said, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She hadn't thought about this part, hadn't let herself think about it. She forced herself to look up for the first time, to actually see the man she'd just married. Caleb Mercer stood about 6 inches taller than her. He had dark hair that needed cutting, falling almost to his collar. His face was weathered in the way of men who worked outside, with lines around his eyes that suggested he was somewhere in his 30s. He wore a clean shirt and vest, simple but well made, and his hands were calloused. His eyes were gray, storm cloud gray. And when they met hers, there was something in them she couldn't identify. Not cruelty, not hunger. Something else. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. His lips brushed her forehead, just her forehead, nothing more. And then he stepped back. It's done, he said quietly. Just to her, not to the crowd. It's done. The church erupted into murmurs. People shifted in their seats, already preparing their stories about what they'd witnessed, already shaping the gossip into something they could trade at the general store and the saloon. Eleanor's father stood in the front pew, his face flushed with satisfaction and relief. He'd gotten what he wanted, always did. Beside him, the empty space where her mother should have been sitting felt like a wound that never healed. Come on, Caleb's voice pulled her back. He wasn't touching her, but he turned toward the door, clearly expecting her to follow. Eleanor gathered the moth-eaten hem of her mother's dress and walked down the aisle. Every step felt surreal. Faces blurred past, Mrs. Kelsey, the mill workers, the shopkeeper's wife, all of them watching, judging, waiting to see what happened next. Outside, the November sky hung low and gray. Montana cold bit through the thin silk dress immediately, sharp enough to make Eleanor's breath catch. The wind carried the smell of coming snow and wood smoke from the town's chimneys. A wagon waited in front of the church. Not fancy, just a simple farm wagon with worn wheels and a canvas cover stretched over the back. 2 horses stood in harness, their breath steaming in the cold air. This is yours? Eleanor hadn't meant to speak. The words just came out. Caleb glanced at her, then at the wagon. It is now. He moved to the back of the wagon, checking something beneath the canvas. Eleanor stood awkwardly on the church steps, unsure what to do with herself. Behind her, people were starting to emerge from the church, her father among them. Mercer. Harrison Voss's voice carried across the yard. He approached with his hand extended, playing the role of gracious father giving away his daughter, playing it for the crowd. Caleb straightened but didn't take the offered hand. We had an agreement, her father continued. letting his hand drop. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You've honored your part. I expect you'll take good care of what's yours now." "What's yours?" Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. Caleb looked at her father for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying that same quiet steadiness she'd heard in the church. "We're done here." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a dismissal. Harrison Voss's smile tightened. He wasn't used to being dismissed, wasn't used to men who didn't laugh at his jokes or buy him drinks or let him control the conversation. For a moment, Eleanor saw the flash of anger in his eyes that she knew so well. But Caleb Mercer wasn't his daughter, wasn't someone he could intimidate or hurt without consequences. "Right," her father said finally. "Well, safe travels then." He didn't look at Eleanor, didn't say goodbye, just turned and walked back toward the church, already moving on to the next thing, the next drink, the next debt. Eleanor watched him go and felt nothing. "You'll want this." She turned. Caleb was holding out a heavy wool coat, dark brown, lined with sheepskin. A man's coat, far too big for her, but it looked warm. "It's a long ride," he said when she didn't move. "You'll freeze in that dress." Eleanor took the coat. Her fingers brushed his for just a second. His skin was rough, warm, and then she pulled the coat on. It swallowed her, the hem hanging past her knees, the sleeves covering her hands completely. But he was right. It was warm. "Can you climb up, or do you need help?" His tone wasn't impatient, just practical, asking a genuine question. "I can manage." Eleanor gathered the coat and dress and climbed onto the wagon seat. It was higher than she'd expected, and the dress made it awkward, but she managed. Caleb swung up beside her a moment later, taking up the reins. The crowd from the church had formed small clusters in the yard, watching, waiting for something worth talking about. Caleb didn't give them anything. He clicked his tongue, and the horses started forward. No ceremony, no grand exit, just a wagon pulling away from a church, carrying a man and a woman who were legally married and completely unknown to each other. Eleanor looked back once. The town of Dry Creek sat in its valley like something dying slowly. Wooden buildings with peeling paint, muddy streets, the saloon, the general store, the mill, the house where she'd grown up, barely visible from here, with its crooked porch and broken shutters. 23 years of her life, and she was leaving it behind in a moth-eaten wedding dress and a borrowed coat. She turned forward and didn't look back again. The road out of town climbed gradually into the foothills. Caleb drove in silence, handling the reins with the ease of long practice. The wagon creaked and swayed over the rutted path. Eleanor sat as far to her side of the bench as possible, trying not to touch him, trying not to think about what came next. What did come next? She knew what happened on wedding nights, knew what men expected from their wives. Her mother had tried to explain once, stumbling over words, her face flushed with embarrassment. Eleanor had learned more from whispered conversations between women at the market, from crude jokes she'd overheard, from the fear in other girls' voices when they talked about marriage. Her stomach twisted. "There's water if you're thirsty." Caleb's voice startled her. He gestured to a canteen hanging from a hook near his feet. "I'm fine. It's going to be a while. 4, maybe 5 hours, depending on the weather. You should drink something." Wasn't a command, more like advice. Eleanor hesitated, then reached for the canteen. Her hands were shaking again, and she hated that he could probably see it. The water was clean and cold. She took a small sip, then capped the canteen and hung it back on the hook. "Thank you." The words felt strange in her mouth. When was the last time she'd thanked someone? When was the last time someone had offered her anything worth thanking them for? Caleb nodded, but didn't respond. Just kept driving. They passed through the last of the foothill farms, small, struggling operations clinging to the edges of viable land. Then the road narrowed, climbing steeper, and the wilderness closed in. Montana in November was a brutal thing. The aspens had already lost their leaves, standing like bone-white skeletons against the darker pines. The grass had gone brown and brittle. Everything looked sharp and cold and unforgiving, like the rest of her life. An hour passed, then another. The sun moved across the gray sky without ever really appearing, just a pale glow behind thick clouds. The temperature dropped. Even in Caleb's coat, Eleanor started to feel the cold seeping through. Storms coming. She looked up. Caleb was studying the sky, his expression unreadable. Can we make it before it hits? Eleanor asked. Maybe. Probably not. He said it so calmly, like getting caught in a Montana snowstorm was just another Tuesday. Eleanor pulled the coat tighter. How much farther? 2 hours? Maybe 3? 3 hours. 3 more hours in this wagon, in this cold, with this stranger who now owned her legally and completely. She tried to imagine what his ranch looked like. Probably a small cabin, rough and isolated. Maybe some outbuildings. A barn if she was lucky. Men who lived alone in the mountains didn't usually bother with comfort or niceties. The first snowflakes started falling 20 minutes later. They came slowly at first, fat and lazy, drifting down from the leaden sky. Within minutes, the air was thick with them. The temperature plummeted. The wind picked up, cutting through the canyon like a knife. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop. What are you doing? Eleanor asked. He didn't answer, just climbed down and went to the back of the wagon, rummaging under the canvas. When he came back, he had a thick wool blanket. Here, he held it out. Eleanor took it, confused, and he climbed back onto the bench. Wrap it around yourself, over the coat. You'll need both. What about you? The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. He looked at her for a moment, those gray eyes searching her face for something. I'll be fine. I'm used to it. He clicked his tongue and the horses started moving again, pushing into the snow that was already starting to accumulate on the road. Eleanor wrapped the blanket around herself. Combined with the coat, it did help. She could feel warmth starting to build, insulating her against the worst of the wind. She watched Caleb from the corner of her eye. He sat straight back despite the cold, his hands steady on the reins. Snow gathered on his shoulders and in his hair. His jaw was tight, and she could see the muscles working in his neck, but he didn't complain. Didn't curse the weather or blame her for slowing them down. Just drove. The storm worsened. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 feet. The road became harder to see, buried under fresh snow. But Caleb never hesitated, never seemed uncertain about which way to go. He drove like a man who knew this route in his sleep. How many times had he made this trip? How long had he been planning this? Eleanor's mind kept circling back to the same questions. Why had he done this? Why had he paid her father's debts? Why had he married a woman he'd never spoken to? Men didn't do things without reasons. Usually, bad reasons. You're wondering, Caleb said suddenly. Eleanor jumped. What? You're wondering why I did it, married you. His voice was still quiet, but it cut through the wind and snow. Eleanor's heart started pounding. She didn't know how to answer, didn't know if she wanted to hear whatever explanation he was about to give. I knew your father was in debt, Caleb continued. He kept his eyes on the road, not looking at her. Heard about it in town. Heard he was looking for a way out, so I made him an offer. You bought me. The words tasted bitter. I paid his debts. That was the agreement. In exchange for me. Yes. At least he was honest about it. At least he wasn't pretending this was something it wasn't. Eleanor pulled the blanket tighter. Why? Needed a wife. There are plenty of women in Dry Creek who would have married you without being purchased first. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the jingle of harness, the whisper of snow against canvas. Didn't want them, he said finally. Eleanor turned to look at him directly. You wanted me? You don't even know me. I know enough. You know nothing. You've never spoken to me before today. Never. I know your father's a drunk and a gambler. Know he treats you worse than his horse. Know you haven't had a kind word or a gentle touch in more years than you can remember. Eleanor's breath caught. She stared at him, this stranger who somehow knew the shape of her pain. How? Small town, Caleb said simply. People talk, even when they shouldn't. The wagon hit a rut, and Eleanor grabbed the seat to steady herself. Her mind was racing. He'd known what her life was like, and he'd still offered to marry her, still paid her father's debts to get her out of that house. Why? What did he want from her? I'm not what you think I am, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I'm not grateful. I'm not going to fall at your feet thanking you for rescuing me. You bought yourself a wife, but you didn't buy yourself someone who's going to worship you for it. Caleb glanced at her then, and there was something almost like amusement in his eyes. Good, he said. I don't want worship. Just want someone to share the work and the table. Someone who won't run off at the first sign of trouble. Is that all? Her voice was sharper than she'd intended. She was pushing, testing, trying to find the cracks where his true intentions would show through. That's all. You expect me to believe you paid my father's debts? Debts that must have been substantial knowing him, just to get a farmhand and a cook? I expect you to believe what you want to believe, Caleb said. I'm just telling you the truth. The truth. Eleanor didn't believe in truth. Didn't believe in men who did kind things without expecting payment. The world didn't work that way. People didn't work that way. There had to be more. She just hadn't found it yet. The snow kept falling. The wagon kept climbing. The road twisted through steep canyons and across high ridges where the wind screamed like something alive. Eleanor lost track of time. Everything became white and gray and cold. Just when she thought she couldn't stand it anymore, Caleb pulled the horses to a stop. There. Eleanor looked up, blinking snow from her eyelashes. Through the white curtain of falling snow, she could just make out shapes. Buildings. A house, a barn, some outbuildings. Blackwood Ridge. Her new prison. Caleb climbed down and came around to her side of the wagon. Can you walk? Eleanor was so cold she wasn't sure, but she nodded and let him help her down. Her legs barely held her. She grabbed the side of the wagon for support. House is this way. I'll get the horses settled after I get you inside. He guided her forward through knee-deep snow. Eleanor could barely see where she was going. She just followed the dark shape of him, trusting that he knew the way. Then they were on a porch. Caleb pushed open a door and warmth flooded out. Go on in. There's wood by the stove. Get the fire going if you can. I'll be back in a few minutes. Then he was gone, back into the snow and wind, leaving Eleanor standing in the doorway of her new home. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The house was dark and quiet. Not silent. The wind rattled the shutters and snow hissed against the windows. But quiet in the way a place feels when no one's been home for a while. Eleanor's eyes adjusted slowly. She could make out shapes. A table, chairs, a wood stove in the corner, shelves, a doorway leading to what might be another room. It wasn't a cabin. It was a real house. Small, maybe 3 or 4 rooms total, but solidly built. The kind of house someone had put thought and care into. Eleanor moved toward the stove. Sure enough, there was split wood stacked neatly beside it, kindling, matches on a shelf. Someone, Caleb, she assumed, had prepared all of this before leaving to collect her. She built a fire the way her mother had taught her years ago. Small pieces first, arranging them carefully, giving them air. The match caught. The kindling smoked, then flared. Soon, flames were licking at the larger pieces of wood. Heat began to fill the room. Eleanor pulled off the wet blanket and coat, hanging them near the stove to dry. Her mother's wedding dress was soaked through at the hem and dusted with snow. She looked around for something to change into, but didn't see anything obvious. She was still standing there, shivering and uncertain, when the door opened and Caleb came back in. Snow covered him completely, like he'd been dipped in white. "Horses are sorted," he said, brushing snow off his shoulders. "Storm's going to get worse before it gets better. We're stuck here for a while." Stuck. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself. "Where do you want me?" Caleb looked at her, and again she saw that expression she couldn't identify. "What do you mean? Where do I sleep? What are my duties? You brought me here for a reason. Just tell me what you want, and I'll do it." The words came out mechanical, flat. She'd learned to make herself numb, to disconnect from whatever was about to happen. It was the only way to survive. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he moved to a door off the main room and opened it. "This is yours." Eleanor didn't move. "Mine?" "Your room. There's a bed, a dresser, a wardrobe. I put some things in there I thought you might need. Dresses, warm clothes, don't know if they'll fit, but they're better than what you've got." Eleanor walked slowly to the doorway and looked inside. It was a real bedroom. A bed with a thick quilt, a dresser with a wash basin and pitcher, a wardrobe against one wall, a window with curtains, a small table with a lamp, a room. Her own room. "I don't understand." "It's yours," Caleb said again. "You can close the door if you want privacy. Lock it if that makes you feel safer. I won't come in unless you ask me to." Eleanor turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway of the main room, still covered in snow, looking tired and cold. "Where's your room?" she asked. He gestured to another door. "There, across the house. You won't be disturbed." Won't be disturbed. The words didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. "I don't understand," Eleanor said again. "You married me. You brought me here. But you're giving me my own room. You're promising not to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Caleb's expression softened slightly. "I'm not your father, Eleanor. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to force you into anything. You're here because I wanted to get you out of that house. That's all. Whatever else happens between us, that's up to you, not me." Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, something small but vital. "Why?" Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why would you do that?" But Caleb just shook his head. "Get changed into dry clothes. There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry. I need to check the barn again before the storm gets worse." Then he was gone, back out into the blizzard, leaving Eleanor standing in the doorway of a room that was apparently hers, in a house that didn't make sense, married to a man who had just promised not to touch her. She closed the door slowly. Then, for the first time since her mother died, Eleanor Voss sat down on a bed that was truly hers and cried. Eleanor woke to silence. Not the heavy, dangerous silence of her father's house, the kind that meant he was passed out or waiting to explode. This was different, clean, the kind of quiet that came from snow muffling everything, wrapping the world in white. She lay still for a moment, disoriented. The bed beneath her was soft, the quilt heavy and warm. Pale morning light filtered through curtains she didn't recognize. Then she remembered. The wedding, the wagon ride, the storm, this room that Caleb had said was hers. Eleanor sat up slowly, her body stiff from cold and exhaustion. She'd cried herself to sleep, still wearing her mother's ruined wedding dress, too tired and confused to do anything else. At some point during the night, she'd pulled off the wet silk and crawled under the quilt in just her underclothings, shivering until warmth finally came. The room looked different in daylight, smaller than she'd thought, but carefully arranged. The dresser was solid oak, worn but well-maintained. The wardrobe stood against the far wall, its door slightly ajar. The window looked out onto a world of white, everything buried under at least 2 feet of fresh snow. Eleanor stood and went to the wardrobe. Inside, just as Caleb had said, were clothes. 3 dresses in different fabrics: wool, cotton, something heavier for winter, a nightgown, stockings, a warm shawl. All simple, practical, clean. She pulled out one of the dresses, a dark green wool that looked about her size. Whoever had selected these had guessed well. Not perfect, but close enough. As she dressed, Eleanor's mind kept circling back to the same confusion from last night. Why had Caleb done all this? Why prepare a room for her? Why give her privacy and promises of safety when he could have taken whatever he wanted? Men didn't act this way. Not in her experience. There had to be something she wasn't seeing yet. She finished dressing and opened her bedroom door carefully, not sure what she'd find. The main room was warm. The wood stove crackled with fresh wood, and morning light came through the windows in clean slants. The house was bigger than she'd realized in last night's darkness. A main room with the kitchen area, the wood stove, a table with 4 chairs, and what looked like a sitting area with 2 worn but comfortable-looking chairs near the windows. Caleb sat at the table, drinking coffee from a tin cup. He'd changed clothes too, dry pants and a flannel shirt, his dark hair still damp like he'd washed recently. When Eleanor entered, he looked up but didn't smile or speak, just watched her with those unreadable gray eyes. "There's coffee," he said finally, "and bread. I'll make eggs if you're hungry." Eleanor's stomach growled at the mention of food, betraying her. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and that had only been a piece of dry toast her father had thrown at her. "I can make my own breakfast," she said. "I know you can. But I'm offering." It wasn't a challenge, just a statement. Eleanor hesitated, then moved toward the kitchen area. A pot of coffee sat on the stove, still steaming. She found a cup on a shelf. Everything was organized, everything in its place, and poured herself some. The coffee was strong and hot. Real coffee, not the chicory stretch stuff her father bought. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the cup, savoring the warmth. "Storm passed in the night," Caleb said. He was still sitting at the table, watching her. "We got about 30 inches. Road won't be passable for a few days at least." A few days. trapped here with him. Eleanor's chest tightened. I need to check on the animals, he continued. Make sure the barn weathered it all right. You can stay inside where it's warm. There's food in the pantry if you get hungry. Wood for the stove. He stood, draining the rest of his coffee. Eleanor watched him move to the door, pulling on a heavy coat and boots. Caleb. He stopped, one hand on the door handle. It was the first time she'd said his name. What do you want from me? The question hung in the warm air between them. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. I want you to stop looking at me like I'm about to hit you, he said finally. But I know that's going to take time. So for now, I just want you to be warm and fed and safe. That's all. Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone in the house. She stood there for several minutes, just holding her coffee, trying to make sense of everything. Then, because she didn't know what else to do, she started exploring. The house was simple but thoughtfully built. The main room served as kitchen and living area, her bedroom off to one side. Caleb's room on the opposite side. The door was closed and she didn't try to open it. A small washroom with a basin and chamber pot. A pantry stocked with flour, beans, rice, dried meat, preserved vegetables in jars. Everything was clean. Not just clean, but cared for. The floors had been swept recently. The dishes were washed and stacked neatly. The wood stove had been blacked and polished. This wasn't a bachelor's rough cabin. This was a home someone had maintained with attention and effort. Eleanor moved back to the main room, her eyes catching on small details she'd missed before. A set of curtains that matched the ones in her bedroom. A rag rug near the door, woven in blues and greens. A shelf with a few books, their spines cracked from reading. Then she saw the chair. 2 chairs sat near the window, angled toward each other like they were meant for conversation. One was larger, worn in the seat from use. The other was smaller, newer looking, the wood still bright. Someone had placed that second chair there intentionally. Recently. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She moved to the kitchen area, really looking this time. 2 cups on the shelf, 2 plates, 2 of everything, where a man living alone would only need 1. In the corner, she spotted something else. A wooden box, empty, sitting on a shelf by itself. The kind of box someone might use for growing herbs or flowers indoors during winter. Waiting for spring. Waiting for someone to plant something in it. Eleanor's hand started shaking again. She set down her coffee cup before she could drop it. This house hadn't been prepared for just anyone. It had been prepared for her. Before the wedding, before the arrangement. Someone had bought that second chair, stocked that pantry with enough food for 2 people, placed those curtains in a bedroom that had been empty. How long had Caleb been planning this? She heard him stomping snow off his boots on the porch. Eleanor quickly moved away from the shelf, not wanting to be caught examining his house like she was looking for evidence, which she realized was exactly what she'd been doing. Caleb came back inside, bringing a gust of cold air with him. His face was red from wind and cold, his coat covered in snow. Barn's fine. Animals made it through all right. He pulled off his coat and hung it by the door. I'll need to dig out the paths this afternoon, clear away to the woodshed and the well. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Caleb moved to the stove, adding more wood. You find everything all right? Yes. Good. He poured himself more coffee. I know this is strange. All of it. You don't know me, don't know this place. But you're not a prisoner here, Eleanor. You can go anywhere you want in the house, use anything you find. This is your home now, too. Your home. The words felt foreign. Eleanor had never had a home. She'd had a place where she existed, where she tried to survive, but never a home. Why did you marry me? The question came out before she could stop it, more direct than she'd intended. Caleb looked at her over his coffee. I told you yesterday. I needed... No. Eleanor cut him off. Don't tell me you needed a wife. Don't tell me you needed someone to share the work. You prepared this entire house for me before you ever made your arrangement with my father. You bought furniture. You stocked a pantry for 2 people. You planned all of this. She could hear her voice rising, emotion bleeding through the careful numbness she usually maintained. So don't lie to me and tell me this was just about needing a farmhand. Tell me the real reason. Caleb set down his cup slowly. For a long moment, he just looked at her, and Eleanor saw something in his expression shift. A decision being made. All right, he said quietly. The real reason. He moved to the table and sat down heavily in one of the chairs. Eleanor stayed standing, her arms wrapped around herself. 15 years ago, Caleb began, I was 12 years old and starving. My parents had died the winter before. Fever took them both within a week of each other. I had no family, nowhere to go, so I ended up in Dry Creek, doing whatever work I could find, cleaning stables, hauling garbage, anything for a few cents or a meal. Eleanor's stomach tightened. She didn't want to hear this, didn't want him to be human, to have a story that would make her feel something. It was January, Caleb continued, coldest winter anyone could remember. I hadn't eaten in 3 days. I was sleeping in a shed behind the mill, stealing what I could, trying not to freeze to death. He paused. Then one morning, I saw you. Me? You were maybe 8 years old, small for your age. You came out of the bakery with your mother. You were carrying a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, holding it like it was precious. Eleanor's breath caught. She didn't remember this. Didn't remember. I was standing in the alley, Caleb said, trying to stay out of sight. But you saw me. Most people looked right through me, or if they did see me, they'd chase me off. But you stopped. You looked at me for a long time, and then you walked over and handed me the bread. Just gave it to me. Your mother tried to stop you, but you insisted. Eleanor felt something cold spreading through her chest, a memory, distant and faded, trying to surface. You didn't say anything, Caleb continued. Didn't make a big show of it. You just gave me the bread and walked away. But you dropped something as you left. A little carved bird. A sparrow. It fell out of your pocket. The sparrow. Eleanor's hand went to her throat. She'd had a carved sparrow as a child. Her mother had bought it for her at the autumn fair. She'd loved that little bird, carried it everywhere until she'd lost it. Winter, during one of the hardest years, she'd cried for days. I kept it, Caleb said. Figured I'd return it to you someday, but you never came back to that part of town. And by the time I thought to look for you properly, I was living up here, and you, he trailed off. And I was trapped in my father's house, Eleanor finished quietly. Yes. Eleanor pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, her legs suddenly unsteady. You've been holding on to a toy I lost 15 years ago? It wasn't just a toy, Caleb's voice was firm. It was a kindness, the first real kindness anyone had shown me in months, maybe ever. You fed a starving boy without asking anything in return, without even knowing my name. You saw someone suffering and you helped. Most people don't do that. I was 8 years old. I probably didn't even understand what I was doing. Maybe, but you did it anyway. Eleanor shook her head. This couldn't be real. People didn't build entire lives around a single moment from childhood. Didn't marry someone because of a piece of bread given by a child. So what, you decided to rescue me? The bitterness crept back into her voice. Repay the debt? I'm not some debt to be settled, Caleb. I'm a person. I know that. He leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. I'm not trying to rescue you like you're some helpless thing. I know you're not helpless. I've watched you survive your father for years. Watched you keep going when most people would have broken. You're stronger than you think you are. Then why? Because I couldn't stand watching it anymore. The words came out harder than Caleb seemed to intend. He took a breath, steadying himself. I'd see you in town sometimes, buying supplies for your father, walking to church. You'd have new bruises, new marks. You'd get thinner every year, and everyone just accepted it. Just let it happen because Harrison Voss was your father, and that gave him the right to destroy you. Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. I couldn't do anything about it for years, Caleb continued. I was just a kid myself, trying to survive, trying to build something up here. But I never forgot. Never forgot what you did for me, or what was being done to you. So when I finally had enough money, enough stability, I decided to do something about it. You bought me. I paid your father's debts to get you out of that house. That's not the same thing. Isn't it? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Maybe it is. Maybe I went about this all wrong, but I couldn't think of another way. Your father wouldn't have just let you leave. And you, he looked at her carefully. You wouldn't have left on your own, not while you thought you had nowhere to go. He was right. Eleanor hated that he was right. She'd thought about running dozens of times over the years. But where would she go? What would she do? A woman alone with no money, no skills beyond basic housework, no family willing to help. She would have ended up in an even worse situation. So you built all this? Eleanor gestured around the house. Prepared everything, made a space for me. Yes. And what do you get out of it? The question seemed to catch Caleb off guard. What do I get? Yes. You paid my father's debts. You married me. You gave me a room, privacy, promises of safety. But what do you want in return? Men don't do things for nothing. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. I want someone to sit with at the table, he said quietly. Someone to talk to in the evenings. Someone who doesn't mind the quiet, but who's there when the quiet gets too heavy. I want to share what I've built here with someone who might actually want to be here. He turned back to face her. I'm not asking you to love me, Eleanor. I'm not even asking you to like me. But I'd like a companion, a partner, someone who sees this place as home and not a prison. That's what I want. If you can give me that, if you want to give me that, then that's enough. Eleanor stared at him. It was the most honest answer anyone had ever given her. No pretty lies about love at first sight, no false promises, just a lonely man who wanted someone to share his life with. And if I can't give you that? She asked. Caleb's expression didn't change. Then you still have a warm house and food and safety. That doesn't change. I meant what I said yesterday. I'm not your father. What happens between us is up to you. Eleanor didn't know what to say. Every instinct she had was screaming that this was a trap, that no man was this patient or this kind without wanting something terrible in return. But another part of her, a small, quiet part she'd tried to bury years ago, wanted desperately to believe him. I need to think, she said finally. Take all the time you need. Caleb moved toward the door, pulling his coat back on. I'm going to start clearing the paths. You should eat something. There's ham in the pantry and fresh eggs in the basket by the door. Then he was outside again, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the warm, carefully prepared house that had been waiting for her. She sat at the table for a long time, just processing. Then, because she didn't know what else to do, she did what Caleb had suggested. She made herself breakfast. The next few days fell into an uneasy rhythm. Caleb worked outside most of the time, clearing snow, tending animals, maintaining the buildings and fences. Eleanor stayed inside, gradually taking over the household tasks, not because he demanded it, but because she needed something to do with her hands, something to occupy her mind. She cooked, she cleaned, she organized the pantry and mended a hole in one of the curtains. She did the things she'd done her entire life, but here it felt different. Nobody yelled at her for using too much flour or taking too long. Nobody criticized every move she made. Caleb ate whatever she put in front of him without complaint. He thanked her after every meal. He washed his own dishes unless she got to them first. He asked her opinion on small things, whether they needed more firewood brought inside, whether the bread needed more salt. It was such a small thing, being asked her opinion. But Eleanor felt it like something physical, like warmth seeping into places that had been frozen for years. They didn't talk much at first. The silences between them were long and awkward. But slowly, as the days passed, Eleanor found herself watching him, learning him. Caleb woke before dawn every morning. He made coffee and sat in the dark for a while before starting his work. He was methodical, organized, doing things in the same order each day. He didn't waste movement or words. When he did speak, it was direct and honest. He never raised his voice, never slammed doors or threw things, never drank beyond a single glass of whiskey in the evening, sipped slowly while he read or repaired tools. On the fourth day, Eleanor found the sparrow. She'd been putting away clean clothes in her dresser when her hand brushed against something small in the back of the top drawer. She pulled it out and her breath caught. The carved sparrow. Her sparrow. The one she'd lost 15 years ago. It was smaller than she remembered, worn smooth from handling, but it was unmistakably the same bird. Eleanor could see the chip on the beak where she'd dropped it on stone, could remember the feel of it in her small hand. Caleb had kept this. For 15 years. Had probably carried it with him through whatever hard years he'd endured, had placed it in her drawer, waiting for her to find it. Eleanor's hands shook as she held the tiny carving. This was real. This wasn't a game or a manipulation. Caleb had remembered a moment from childhood and held on to it like it mattered, like she mattered. That evening, after dinner, Eleanor placed the sparrow on the table between them. Caleb looked at it, then at her. He didn't say anything. "Why did you put it in my drawer?" Eleanor asked. "Thought you might want it back. You could have just given it to me, explained everything right away." Caleb shrugged slightly. "Didn't want to overwhelm you. Figured you'd find it when you were ready." Eleanor picked up the sparrow, turning it over in her fingers. "I cried for days when I lost this. My mother searched everywhere. We never found it. I should have returned it sooner, but I didn't know where you lived back then, and later—" He trailed off. "Later I was locked in my father's house, and you were up here building a life." "Yes." Eleanor set the sparrow down carefully. "Tell me about this place, about Blackwood Ridge. How did you end up here?" It was the first real question she'd asked him that wasn't defensive or suspicious. Caleb seemed to recognize that. He leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup cradled in his hands. "After that winter in Dry Creek, I worked for a rancher about 20 miles south. Hard man, but fair. He taught me about cattle, about surviving up here. When he died, he left me a small inheritance. Not much, but enough to buy some land. I found this spot and knew it was what I wanted. It's isolated. That's what I liked about it. No neighbors to bother me, no town gossip, just land and sky and work." "Doesn't it get lonely?" Caleb looked at her directly. "Yes." The honesty of it struck Eleanor. He didn't try to pretend he was fine alone, didn't act like he didn't need anyone, just admitted the truth plainly. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked. "Bringing me here." "About 2 years. That's when I heard your father's debts were getting serious. I started preparing then, building that second room, buying furniture, getting everything ready." 2 years? Eleanor shook her head. "You spent 2 years preparing for someone you'd never spoken to." "I spoke to you once, when we were children. I gave you bread. That's not speaking." "You saw me," Caleb said quietly. "Really saw me. That was more than most people did then or do now." Eleanor didn't know how to respond to that. She picked up the sparrow again, holding it tight. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to live with someone who doesn't hurt me. I keep waiting for it. Waiting for you to show me who you really are." "I know. How can you be so patient?" "Because I spent years watching you be hurt. I'm not about to add to it." The simple truth of it made Eleanor's throat tight. She stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something with the emotion building in her chest. "I'm going to make tea. Do you want some?" "Yes, thank you." Eleanor moved to the kitchen area, grateful for the task. As she heated water and measured out tea leaves, she felt Caleb watching her. Not in the way her father had watched, looking for mistakes, for reasons to criticize. Just watching, seeing her. When she brought the tea back to the table, she noticed something on the shelf she hadn't seen before. A book, different from the others. She recognized it immediately. "Is that the book of poems your mother used to read from?" "Yes." Eleanor's hand went to her throat. "How did you know about that?" "I saw her reading to you once, in the churchyard. She had that green book, and you were sitting on the bench, listening. You looked happy." He'd been watching her even then, years ago, seeing these small moments and remembering them. Eleanor felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about herself, about being invisible, it was wrong. She hadn't been invisible. Not to Caleb. "I need some air," she said abruptly. She grabbed her shawl and went outside onto the porch before Caleb could respond. The cold hit her like a slap, but she needed it, needed something sharp and real to ground her. The snow had finally stopped. The sky was clear and full of stars, more stars than she'd ever seen. The mountains rose up on all sides, massive and indifferent. The only sounds were the wind through the pines and the occasional creak of settling snow. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter and sat down on the porch steps. Her breath came out in white clouds. Her mind raced. She'd spent so many years making herself small, invisible, trying to survive by not being noticed. And all that time, someone had been noticing. Someone had been seeing her, remembering her, building a life with space for her in it. The door opened behind her. Caleb came out with a blanket and draped it over her shoulders without a word. Then he sat down on the steps beside her, keeping a respectful distance. They sat in silence for a while. "I'm scared," Eleanor finally said. "Of me?" "Of this." of believing it's real and then having it taken away. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. Can't promise this life will be easy. But I can promise I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not taking this away from you. Eleanor pulled the blanket tighter. You don't know me. Not really. You've been watching me for years, but that's not the same as knowing someone. What if you don't like who I actually am? Then I'll deal with it, but I don't think that's going to happen. How can you be so sure? Caleb looked up at the stars. Because I've seen how you survive. I've seen your kindness even when you had nothing. I've seen you keep going when anyone else would have quit. That tells me everything I need to know. Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks but didn't wipe them away. Let them fall. Let herself feel something other than numbness or fear. I don't know how to be a wife, she whispered. I don't know how to be a husband. We'll figure it out together. Together. The word hung in the cold air between them, full of possibility and terror. Eleanor had never been part of a together before, had never had someone who wanted to figure things out with her instead of just telling her what to do. Can I ask you something? She said. Anything. That empty flower box in the house, what's it for? Caleb smiled slightly. It was the first time she'd seen him really smile. Thought you might like to grow something, herbs maybe, or flowers, something to tend during winter, something that's yours. Something that's yours. Eleanor thought about that, about having something of her own to tend and care for, about putting down roots in this place, literally and figuratively. I'd like that, she said quietly. They sat together on the porch steps until the cold became too much to bear. Then they went inside and Eleanor made more tea, and they sat at the table talking about small things, what crops grew well in these mountains, how harsh the winters got, where the best fishing spots were. Normal things, easy things. The kind of conversation people had when they were learning each other. And for the first time since arriving at Blackwood Ridge, Eleanor felt something other than fear or confusion. She felt the smallest spark of hope. The hope didn't last long. 3 weeks after Eleanor found the sparrow, the sky turned the color of old bruises. Caleb stood on the porch that morning, coffee in hand, staring at the horizon with an expression Eleanor had learned meant trouble. What is it? She asked from the doorway. Big storm coming, bigger than the last one. Eleanor looked at the sky. It didn't look that different to her, but she'd learned Caleb could read weather the way some men read newspapers. How big? Big enough we need to prepare now. He drained his coffee and set the cup on the porch rail. I need to bring the cattle closer to the barn, get extra feed down from the loft, make sure everything's secured. What should I do? Caleb turned to look at her. Over the past weeks, they'd fallen into something like a routine. Not quite comfortable, not quite easy, but functional. Eleanor cooked and managed the house. Caleb worked the ranch and handled the heavy labor. They ate meals together and sometimes talked in the evenings. They were learning to exist in the same space without constant tension. But they were still careful around each other, still testing boundaries. Fill every container we have with water, Caleb said. The well might freeze if this gets bad, as I think it will. And bring in enough wood to last us a week. Stack it by the stove and in the corner there. A week? You think we'll be trapped that long? Maybe longer. Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest, but pushed it down. All right, I'll start now. Caleb nodded and headed toward the barn. Eleanor went back inside and began hauling water. She filled the big pot on the stove, the wash basin, every pitcher and bucket she could find. Her arms ached by the time she finished, but she kept going, moving to the woodshed. The temperature had already dropped. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of coming snow. Eleanor made trip after trip, her arms full of split logs, until she'd built a pile inside that reached her waist. By early afternoon, the first flakes started falling. Caleb came back inside, covered in snow and breathing hard. Cattle are as close as I can get them. Extra hay's in the barn. I reinforced the door on the chicken coop. Is there anything else we need to do? Pray this passes quick. He said it like a joke, but Eleanor heard the tension underneath. She'd never seen Caleb worried before. He was always so steady, so calm. Seeing him tense made her own anxiety spike. The storm hit hard around sunset. One moment it was just heavy snow. The next, the wind started screaming. It slammed against the house like something alive and angry, rattling the shutters, finding every crack and gap in the walls. The temperature plummeted. Even with the stove burning hot, Eleanor could feel cold seeping in around the windows. "That's going to get worse before it gets better," Caleb said. He was standing at the window, watching the white wall of wind and snow outside. Eleanor brought him coffee. He took it absently, his mind clearly elsewhere. "The cattle," he said. "If they panic, if they scatter, you can't go out there." "Might have to." "Caleb, you can't even see 10 feet in that. You'll get lost and freeze to death." He didn't argue, but she could see the conflict in his face. This ranch was everything to him. These animals represented years of work, of saving, of building something from nothing. Losing them would be devastating. The wind got worse. It howled around the house like wolves, constant and relentless. Snow piled against the windows. Eleanor could hear things banging outside, loose boards, maybe part of a fence. The house creaked and groaned under the assault. They ate dinner in tense silence. Eleanor had made stew, but neither of them had much appetite. Caleb kept glancing at the window, his jaw tight. "You should sleep," Eleanor said finally. "There's nothing you can do tonight." "I know." But he didn't move, just sat at the table, one hand wrapped around his coffee cup, staring at nothing. Eleanor cleaned up the dishes, hyper-aware of him behind her. The storm made the house feel smaller somehow, more intimate. She and Caleb had been good about maintaining their distance, their separate spaces. But tonight, with the world trying to tear itself apart outside, that distance felt harder to keep. Around midnight, something crashed outside, loud enough to be heard over the wind. Caleb was on his feet immediately. "That was the barn." "You don't know that." "I know what my barn sounds like." He was already pulling on his coat. Eleanor's heart jumped into her throat. "You can't go out there, Caleb, please. It's suicide." "If the barn's damaged, the animals will freeze. I have to check." "Then I'm coming with you." "No." "Yes." Eleanor grabbed her own coat. "If you get disoriented, you'll need someone to help you find your way back. I can hold a rope, tie it to the porch. You can follow it back if you lose your bearings." Caleb looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe. Or respect. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know, but I'm doing it anyway." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "There's rope in the pantry, heavy stuff, about 50 feet. Eleanor found it and brought it out." Caleb tied one end to the porch railing, testing the knot twice. Then he wrapped the other end around his waist. "Stay inside," he told Eleanor. "Keep the door cracked so I can see the light. If the rope goes slack, pull on it. 3 hard tugs means I need help. If you feel that, you pull me back whether I want to come or not. Understand?" "I understand." "Eleanor." He caught her arm gently. "If something happens to me out there, you stay inside. You keep the fire going. In a few days, the storm will pass and you can make it down to the Hendersons' place about 5 miles south. Follow the creek. Don't try to save me if things go wrong. Promise me." The intensity in his eyes scared her. This wasn't just caution. This was a man who understood how quickly things could go bad in a Montana blizzard. "I promise," she lied. Caleb seemed to know it was a lie, but he didn't call her on it. He just pulled his hat down tight and stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly ripped the door from Eleanor's hands. She braced it open just enough to see out, holding tight to the frame. Caleb disappeared into the white almost immediately. She could only track him by watching the rope unspool from the coil at her feet. Time stopped meaning anything. Eleanor stood in the doorway, freezing wind cutting through her clothes, watching that rope. The cold was vicious. Her fingers went numb. Her face felt like it might crack and fall off. But she didn't move. Didn't close the door, just kept that light shining and that rope visible. The rope stopped moving. Eleanor's heart hammered. Had he reached the barn? Was he checking the damage, or had something gone wrong? She counted to 60, then to 60 again. The rope didn't move. Then she felt it. 3 hard tugs. He needs help. Eleanor didn't think. She grabbed the rope and started pulling, hand over hand, hauling it in, following it out into the storm before she could talk herself out of it. The cold was shocking. The wind hit her like a physical thing, shoving her sideways. Snow blinded her instantly. She couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except the roar of the wind. But she had the rope. She held onto it with both hands and pulled herself forward. She nearly ran into him. Caleb was on his knees in the snow, struggling with something. As Eleanor got closer, she realized it was one of the calves. The young animal was down, too cold or too scared to move, and Caleb was trying to lift it. "Help me!" he shouted over the wind. Eleanor grabbed the calf's other side. Together, they lifted the animal. It wasn't huge, but it was heavy and awkward and terrified. The calf kicked and struggled, nearly breaking free. "The barn!" Caleb yelled. 20 feet that way." They staggered forward. Eleanor couldn't feel her hands anymore, couldn't feel her feet. The world was just white and cold and noise. But she held on to that calf and moved. Then there was a wall. The barn. Caleb fumbled with the door and it swung open. They pushed the calf inside where 3 other cattle huddled together for warmth. The barn was damaged, part of the roof had lifted and snow was getting in, but it was still standing. Caleb slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breathing hard. "We need to get back!" Getting back was worse than coming out. They were both exhausted now, cold beyond anything Eleanor had ever experienced. Her legs felt like wood. She couldn't stop shaking. Caleb had her by the arm, pulling her along, following the rope. When they finally stumbled onto the porch and through the door, Eleanor's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the floor, shaking so violently her teeth rattled. Caleb locked the door and immediately went to the stove, throwing in more wood, building up the fire. Then he knelt beside Eleanor. "Can you stand?" She tried. Couldn't. Everything hurt too much. Caleb didn't hesitate. He picked her up and carried her to the chair closest to the stove. Then he started stripping off her wet coat, her shawl, her boots. His own coat was already off. "We need to get warm," he said. His voice was tight, controlled. "Frostbite will set in if we don't." Eleanor just nodded. She couldn't form words, couldn't think past the cold. Caleb wrapped her in blankets, then pulled his chair right next to hers and wrapped more blankets around both of them. The fire roared in the stove. Slowly, painfully, warmth started seeping back into Eleanor's body. With warmth came pain. Her fingers burned. Her toes felt like they were being stabbed with knives. She gasped. "I know," Caleb said quietly. "I know it hurts. But that's good. Means there's no serious damage." They sat there for what felt like hours, just thawing out. Outside, the storm continued its assault. Inside, the fire crackled and warmth gradually filled the space. Eleanor's shaking finally stopped. She looked over at Caleb. His face was red from the cold, his hair still wet with melted snow. But he was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You came out after me," he said. "You sent the signal. I meant for you to pull the rope, not come out yourself." "I know what you meant." Caleb shook his head slightly. "You could have died. So could you. That calf isn't worth your life, Eleanor." "Maybe not. But you are." The words came out before Eleanor could stop them. She felt her face flush, and not from the cold this time. Caleb went very still. "What?" Eleanor looked away. "I just meant you're my husband, legally. It wouldn't make sense for me to let you die when—" "Eleanor." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Did you mean that?" he asked quietly. Eleanor's heart pounded. This was it. The moment where she could retreat back behind her walls, make a joke, deflect. The safe choice. But she was tired of safe choices. Tired of protecting herself from everything. "Yes," she said. "I meant it. I don't know what this is between us. I don't know if it's just convenience or proximity or something more. But I know I didn't want you to die out there. I know the thought of it made me sick. So yes, I came after you because you're worth coming after." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something he'd never done before. He reached over and took her hand. His hand was warm now, rough and calloused from work. It completely engulfed hers. Eleanor's first instinct was to pull away, but she didn't. She let him hold her hand and told herself it meant nothing, even though she knew it meant everything. "I need to tell you something," Caleb said. "The whole truth, not just the parts I've been giving you in pieces." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "What truth?" "There was no debt." She blinked. "What?" "Your father's debts. They existed, but they weren't the reason I married you. I made that up." Eleanor pulled her hand back, confusion and anger warring in her chest. "I don't understand."
Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. I told you I'd been watching you for years. That was true. I saw what your father did to you, saw how you lived, and I couldn't stand it anymore, so I decided to get you out of there. By lying to me? By giving your father a reason to let you go. He never would have agreed to let you marry me just because you wanted to. He saw you as property, as something he owned, but if I could convince him there was money in it for him. Eleanor felt like the floor was tilting. So you made up debts? I found out what he actually owed. Then I went to those creditors and paid them off before approaching your father. When I told him I'd clear his debts in exchange for marrying you, he thought he was getting a deal. Thought I was some desperate fool who didn't know better. You played him? Yes. Eleanor stood up, his blanket falling off her shoulders. She needed to move, needed space. You manipulated both of us. You made me think I was being sold to pay off debts, made my father think he was tricking you, when really you were orchestrating the whole thing. Yes, Caleb said again. He didn't try to justify it or explain it away, just admitted it. Why? Eleanor demanded. Why go through all that? Why not just ask me? Tell me you wanted to help. Give me a choice. Caleb stood too, facing her across the small space. Because you wouldn't have said yes. You wouldn't have trusted me, wouldn't have believed I didn't want something from you. And even if you did believe me, you would have felt guilty, would have felt like you owed me. This way, it looked like a business arrangement, something you could accept without feeling like you were taking charity. That wasn't your decision to make. I know. You decided what was best for me without asking me, without giving me any choice in the matter. How is that different from what my father did? The question hung in the air between them. Caleb flinched like she'd hit him. You're right, he said quietly. It's not that different. I took your choice away. I decided I knew what was best for you and I didn't give you a say in it. That was wrong. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself. She felt betrayed and angry and confused. But underneath all of that was something else, something she didn't want to look at too closely. I thought this was real, she said. I thought maybe there was actually a reason, a real reason, that you married me. Not just that you felt sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for you. Then what? What do you feel? Caleb ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. I feel like a boy who got one act of kindness when he needed it most and never forgot. I feel like someone who watched a good person get destroyed by a cruel man and couldn't stand by anymore. I feel... He stopped, took a breath. I feel like I've been waiting 15 years for you, he finished quietly. Not because you're some perfect angel. Not because I think you need saving, but because that little girl who gave me bread saw something in me worth helping. And I've spent every day since trying to become someone worthy of that. Someone who could build a life worth offering to you if I ever got the chance. Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes. That's a lot to put on a child's kindness. I know, and maybe I've built this up into something it never was. Maybe I've been holding on to a fantasy for 15 years. But when I see you, Eleanor, I don't see damaged goods or someone broken. I see someone who survived, someone strong enough to endure what would have killed other people, someone I want to know better. You've been watching me for years. You already know me. I know what I've observed. That's not the same thing. I don't know what you think about late at night. Don't know what makes you laugh or what you dream about or what you want from life. I don't know you. But I want to, if you'll let me. Eleanor turned away, looking at the fire. The storm outside was still raging, but inside it was warm and quiet, except for the crackle of burning wood. I don't know how to trust this, she admitted. Every time I start to believe this is real, something happens to remind me that people don't just do kind things, that there's always a catch. There's no catch, isn't there? You just admitted you manipulated me into this marriage, that you lied about the whole reason for it. How am I supposed to trust anything you say now? Caleb was quiet for a moment. You're not. You're supposed to watch what I do. Actions matter more than words. I can tell you I'm not going to hurt you, but that doesn't mean anything until you see it proven over and over. I can tell you this is real, but you won't believe it until time passes and I'm still here, still treating you with respect, still keeping my promises. He moved closer, not touching her, but near enough she could feel his warmth. I know I went about this wrong, he said. I know I should have given you a choice, but I'm not sorry I got you out of that house. I'm not sorry you're here, and I'm not sorry I built this place with you in mind.
The only thing I'm sorry about is that I lied. So I'm telling you the truth now. All of it. What you do with that truth is up to you."
Eleanor closed her eyes. She was so tired, tired of being suspicious and guarded, tired of waiting for the other shoe to drop, but she didn't know how to be any other way. "What if I can't?" she whispered. "What if I can't ever trust this? Can't ever believe it's real? Then we keep living as we have been, sharing the house, sharing meals, being civil to each other. That's enough." "Is it? Is that really enough for you?"
Caleb was quiet for so long Eleanor thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice low. "No, but I'll take what you can give me. That's all I've ever asked for." Eleanor turned to face him. He was so close. Close enough she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, close enough to see the exhaustion and honesty in his face. She thought about him spending 2 years preparing a house for her, thought about the sparrow he'd kept for 15 years, thought about him risking his life in a blizzard for a calf, and her running out after him without thinking twice. Maybe trust wasn't something you found. Maybe it was something you built. One day at a time, one choice at a time. Eleanor lifted her hand and placed it on Caleb's chest. She could feel his heart beating, steady and strong. He didn't move, didn't try to touch her back, just stood there and let her choose. "I'm scared," she said. "I know. I don't know how to do this, how to let someone in. We'll figure it out together." There was that word again, together. Eleanor took a breath and made a choice. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against Caleb's shoulder. For a moment he didn't move. Then his arms came up slowly, carefully, and wrapped around her. It was the first time they'd truly touched beyond brief moments of necessity. Eleanor felt his warmth, his strength, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. She felt safe in a way she'd never felt safe before. "I don't forgive you for lying," she said into his shirt. "I don't expect you to. But I understand why you did it, and I think maybe I'm glad you did. Even if you went about it wrong." Caleb's arms tightened slightly around her. "I'll spend every day proving to you that it was worth it, that this is real." They stood there for a long time, holding each other while the storm tried to tear the world apart outside. Eventually they moved back to the chairs by the fire. Sitting close enough their shoulders touched, not quite ready to let go of this new understanding between them. The storm lasted 3 more days. 3 days of being trapped together in the small house while the wind screamed and the snow piled higher and higher. But something had shifted between them that first night. The walls they'd kept up started coming down. They talked, really talked. Caleb told her about the years after his parents died, about building this ranch from nothing, about the loneliness of living up here alone. Eleanor told him about her mother, about the good years before she died, about learning to survive in her father's house. They shared meals and played cards and read aloud from the books on Caleb's shelf. They argued about small things, whether beans needed more salt, who was better at starting fires, normal, easy arguments that didn't feel dangerous. And slowly, Eleanor started to believe. On the 4th morning, she woke to silence. Not the muffled silence of falling snow, but real silence. She got up and looked out her window. The storm had passed. The sky was clear and painfully blue. The sun reflecting off the snow was so bright it hurt to look at. Eleanor found Caleb already outside, digging out the paths. She pulled on her warmest clothes and went to help him. They worked side by side for hours, clearing snow, checking the animals, assessing damage. The barn had lost part of its roof but was still functional. They'd lost 1 chicken to the cold, but the rest had survived. The cattle were hungry but alive. By late afternoon, they'd done what they could. They stood on the porch together, looking out at the transformed landscape. Everything was white and clean and new. "Spring's still a long way off," Caleb said. "I know. Going to be a hard winter." "I know that too." Caleb glanced at her. "You holding up all right?"
Eleanor thought about it, really thought about it. A month ago, she'd stood in a church in Dry Creek believing she was being sold to a stranger, believing her life was over. Now she was standing on a porch in the mountains, exhausted and cold and strangely content. "Yeah," she said, "I think I am." Caleb smiled. It was small but genuine. "Good, because I'm going to need your help fixing that barn roof." Eleanor smiled back. "I've never fixed a roof before." "Then you'll learn. I'll teach you." "I'll teach you." Not
I'll do it while you watch. Not you're not capable. Just a simple promise to share the knowledge, to work together. That night, after dinner, Eleanor planted seeds in the wooden box Caleb had left on the shelf. Herbs, he'd told her, rosemary and thyme that would grow slowly through winter and be ready by spring. She pressed the seeds into soil and covered them gently. Caleb watched from his chair, saying nothing, but she could feel his attention. There, she said when she finished. Now we wait. Waiting's the hardest part, Caleb said. Eleanor looked at him and knew he wasn't just talking about the seeds. She moved to her chair and sat down, closer than she usually did. Close enough their knees almost touched. Maybe, she said, but I think I'm getting better at it. Outside, the Montana night settled over Blackwood Ridge. The stars came out brilliant and cold. The mountains stood silent and eternal. And inside the small house, two people who'd once been strangers sat together in comfortable quiet, learning slowly that maybe trust wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. Maybe it was just about showing up, day after day, storm after storm. Until one morning, you woke up and realized you weren't alone anymore. The herbs grew slowly, just like everything else on Blackwood Ridge. Eleanor checked them every morning, watching for the first green shoots to push through the dark soil. Caleb teased her about it over breakfast one day, saying she was going to wear a hole in the floor from pacing back and forth to that shelf. They'll grow faster if you stop staring at them, he said, pouring more coffee. That's not how plants work. Isn't it? Seems like you're making them nervous. Eleanor threw a dish towel at him. He caught it, grinning, and that small moment of playfulness felt like a victory. They'd been learning to be easy with each other, learning that not everything had to be heavy or careful. It was late February now, 3 months since the wedding. The worst of winter was behind them, though spring was still weeks away. The snow had settled into a permanent layer, crusted hard on top, and the days were getting incrementally longer. Eleanor could feel the land waiting, holding its breath for warmth that would eventually come. She and Caleb had fallen into rhythms that felt almost natural. He still woke before dawn. She still made coffee while he checked the animals. They ate breakfast together, worked through the day on separate tasks, came back together for dinner. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, sometimes just existing in comfortable silence. Eleanor had started learning things she'd never expected to learn. How to mend a fence, how to treat a cow with bloat, how to read the sky for weather changes. Caleb taught her patiently, never making her feel stupid for not knowing, never treating her like she was fragile. And she was learning him too, learning that he was quietest when he was worried, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, that he was meticulous about some things and completely careless about others, that he still kept the carved sparrow on his bedside table even though he'd given it back to her. She'd found that out by accident, walking past his open door one morning, had seen it sitting there beside his lamp, and felt something warm spread through her chest. They hadn't talked about the future, hadn't talked about what they were becoming to each other. Eleanor still slept in her own room with the door closed, and Caleb never pushed for more than she was ready to give. But the walls between them were thinner now, easier to see through. On the morning it happened, Eleanor was making bread. Her hands worked the dough in steady, practiced movements, while Caleb sat at the table repairing a harness. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for the sound that made them both freeze. Hoofbeats. Caleb stood immediately, moving to the window. Eleanor's hand stilled in the flour. "Who is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Your father." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. She abandoned the bread and moved to the window, looking over Caleb's shoulder. Sure enough, Harrison Voss sat on a tired-looking horse, making his way up the snowed-in path toward the house. "What does he want?" Eleanor's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Nothing good." Caleb was already moving toward the door. "Stay inside." "No." He turned to look at her. "Eleanor, no," she repeated, more firmly this time. "This is my house too. I'm not hiding from him." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Pride, maybe, or concern, but he nodded. "All right, but stay behind me." They went out onto the porch together. The cold air bit at Eleanor's face, but she barely felt it. All her attention was locked on the man riding toward them. Her father looked worse than she remembered. Thinner, his face more haggard. His coat was patched badly, and his horse looked like it hadn't eaten well in weeks. but his eyes were the same, hard and calculating and mean. He pulled the horse to a stop at the bottom of the porch steps, didn't dismount, just sat there, looking at Eleanor and Caleb with an expression that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Well," Harrison said, "look at you, playing house up here in the mountains." Eleanor's old instinct was to look down, to make herself small, but Caleb stood beside her, solid and present, and she forced herself to meet her father's eyes. "What do you want?" Caleb asked. His voice was level but cold. "Can a father visit his daughter, see how she's settling into married life?" "You're not here for a social call." Harrison's smile was ugly. "Always were a smart one, Mercer." "Fine, let's speak plain. I'm in a tight spot. Some debts came due that I didn't account for. Need a bit of money to get me through." "No," Caleb said simply. "Now, hold on. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking my son-in-law for a small loan. Family helps family, don't they?" "We're not family. You sold your daughter to clear your gambling debts. That transaction is finished." Eleanor flinched at the bluntness of it, even though it was true. Harrison's face darkened. "That's a hell of a way to talk about a sacred bond. I gave you my blessing. You gave me nothing," Caleb cut him off. "I paid your creditors and took Eleanor off your hands because you saw her as a burden you could profit from. There's no bond here, no family, just a business arrangement that's concluded." Harrison's eyes shifted to Eleanor. "You gonna let him speak for you, girl? You just gonna stand there quiet while—" "Yes," Eleanor interrupted. Her voice shook but held. "Because he's right. You didn't give me away. You sold me. And you don't get to come back now looking for more." Her father's expression went from calculating to genuinely angry. "You ungrateful little—" "Enough." Caleb's voice was sharp. "You need to leave. Now. I'm not going anywhere until I get what I came for." "Then you're not going anywhere because you're not getting a cent from us." Harrison looked between them, his face flushing red. Eleanor knew that look, had seen it 1,000 times before, right before his hand would fly or his voice would start shouting. Her body tensed, preparing for violence. But she wasn't in his house anymore, and Caleb stood between her and her father like a wall. "You made a deal with me," Harrison said to Caleb. "You paid my debts, took my daughter. But those debts keep coming, Mercer. Seems only fair you keep paying them since you wanted her so bad." "That's not how this works." "Then maybe I take her back. Marriage can be annulled. Girl never wanted to marry you anyway. Did you, Eleanor?" Eleanor's breath caught. It was a bluff. Had to be. But the threat of it still sent ice through her veins. "She's not going anywhere," Caleb said. His hand moved to rest on the porch railing, casual, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. "And you need to leave. Last warning." "Or what? You'll shoot me?" "That'll look real good to the law. Man kills his wife's father over a few dollars." "I won't shoot you, but I will drag you off my property and let you find your own way back to town. In this cold, on that half-dead horse, I don't like your chances." The two men stared at each other. Eleanor felt like she couldn't breathe. Everything hung suspended, waiting to tip one way or the other. Then her father laughed. It was bitter and harsh. "Look at you, trying to play the big man, protecting your investment." "She's not an investment." "No? Then what is she? You think she loves you? Think she's here because she wants to be? She's here because she had nowhere else to go, because she's too scared and too broken to do anything else." Eleanor felt the words like slaps, not because they came from her father, but because part of her had wondered the same thing. Part of her still questioned whether what she and Caleb were building was real or just convenience wrapped up in desperation. But then Caleb spoke, and his voice was steady as stone. "You're wrong. About her and about me. Eleanor's here because this is her home, because she chose to stay. And whether she loves me or not isn't your business or anyone else's. Now get off my property." Harrison's horse shifted nervously. Eleanor's father gripped the reins tighter, his knuckles white. "You'll regret this," he said. "Both of you, when I come back." "You won't come back," Eleanor heard herself say. Her voice was stronger now, fueled by something hot and bright rising in her chest. "Because there's nothing here for you. No money, no daughter you can control. Nothing." Her father's eyes locked on hers. "You think you're better than me now? Think living up here with him makes you worth something?" "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that I was always worth something. You just couldn't see it because you were too busy destroying everything you touched." The silence that followed felt enormous.
Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, could feel Caleb's presence beside her like an anchor. Harrison Voss looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he spat in the snow. "You deserve each other," he said. "Two broken people playing at having a life." He yanked his horse around and kicked it into motion. The animal stumbled, exhausted, but moved. They watched him ride back down the path, getting smaller and smaller until he disappeared around the bend in the trees. Eleanor stood frozen on the porch, staring at the empty space where her father had been. She was shaking. Not from cold, but from adrenaline and shock and the enormity of what had just happened. "Eleanor," Caleb's voice was gentle. She turned to look at him. "You all right?"
She opened her mouth to say yes, to say she was fine, to push down everything she was feeling, but then something broke open inside her chest, and she was crying. Hard, gasping sobs that she couldn't control. Caleb pulled her against him immediately. His arms came around her, and he held her while she fell apart on the porch of the house that was supposed to be her refuge. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I'm sorry. Don't apologize. Let it out." So she did. She cried for the little girl who'd given bread to a starving boy. She cried for the years of cruelty and fear. She cried for her mother, who hadn't lived to see her escape. She cried because her father had come back, and for a moment she'd been terrified he could actually take her away from this place. And she cried because she'd stood up to him, because she'd chosen Caleb and this life and herself, because for the first time she'd fought back. When the tears finally subsided, she pulled back slightly, embarrassed. "I got your shirt wet." "I don't care about the shirt." Eleanor looked up at him. His face was serious, concerned. "He's not coming back, is he?" "No. Men like your father, they move on to easier targets. You stood up to him, showed him you're not afraid anymore. That's not what he wants." "I am afraid, though." "I know, but you did it anyway. That's what courage is." Eleanor wiped at her face with her sleeve. "He was right about one thing." "What's that?" "I am broken. I am scared. I don't know if I'll ever be normal or whole or—" "Stop." Caleb's hands came up to frame her face gently. "You're not broken. You're healing. There's a difference." "How do you know?" "Because I've watched you these past months. Watched you get stronger. Watched you start to trust. Watched you plant seeds in a box and check them every morning like you believe they'll grow." His thumbs brushed away her tears. "Broken people don't plant seeds, Eleanor. They don't plan for spring. You're not broken. You're just learning how to live without being hurt." Eleanor closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "What if he tries to come back? What if— Then we'll deal with it, together. But I don't think he will. He saw what he needed to see today, that you're not his anymore, that you've got someone who'll stand with you. You would have fought him for me." It wasn't a question. Eleanor knew the answer. "Without hesitation," Caleb confirmed. "Why?" "Because you're my wife. Because this is your home. Because no one gets to hurt you anymore. Not while I'm breathing." The fierceness in his voice made Eleanor's chest tight. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Really looked at him. At this man who'd spent 15 years remembering an act of childhood kindness, who'd built a house for her before she knew she needed one, who stood between her and her demons without being asked. "Caleb." "Yeah? I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad this happened, all of it, even the parts that were hard." Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe. Or hope. "Yeah? Yeah?" They stood there on the porch, Caleb's hands still framing her face, Eleanor's hands resting on his chest. The moment stretched between them, full of things neither of them quite knew how to say. Then Caleb leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, and kissed her forehead, just like he had at their wedding, gentle and respectful and safe. But this time, Eleanor didn't want safe. She wanted real. She rose on her toes and kissed him properly. On the mouth. It was brief and unpracticed and probably clumsy, but it was hers. Her choice. Her decision. When she pulled back, Caleb looked stunned. "Eleanor, don't," she said quickly. "Don't ask me if I'm sure, or if I'm ready, or if this is what I want. I'm tired of being careful. I'm tired of protecting myself from everything. I want to try. I want to see what this could be if I stopped being scared. Caleb's hand slid from her face to her shoulders. We can go as slow as you need to. I know, and I probably will need to go slow. I'll probably panic and pull away and be difficult about everything, but I want to try. With you. If you'll be patient with me. Eleanor, I've waited 15 years. I can wait as long as you need. She smiled despite everything. Despite her father's visit and her tears and the fact that she was still shaking slightly. That's a very romantic thing to say. Is it? I was just being honest. I know. That's what makes it romantic. Caleb smiled then, that rare, full smile that transformed his whole face. Then he kissed her again, carefully, like she was something precious. And Eleanor kissed him back and tried not to think about all the reasons this was terrifying. They went back inside eventually, driven by the cold. The bread dough had risen too much, overflowing the bowl. Eleanor looked at it and laughed. Ruined! Punch it down. Start over. It'll be fine. So she did, and Caleb went back to his harness repair, and everything was both completely different and exactly the same. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that her father would return. Every time she heard a sound outside, every time the horses whinnied, her body would tense. But days passed and then weeks, and Harrison Voss didn't come back. Caleb had been right. Her father had moved on to easier prey. Something settled in Eleanor after that. Some tight, anxious thing she'd been carrying for years finally loosened its grip. She was safe here, really safe. Not just physically, but in every way that mattered. She started sleeping with her door open, not because Caleb asked her to, but because she wanted to, because the sound of him moving around in the morning made her feel less alone, because closing the door felt like she was hiding from something that wasn't there anymore. Caleb noticed but didn't comment, just left his own door open too, a silent acknowledgement of the shift between them. They were getting closer in ways Eleanor hadn't expected. Small touches became normal. His hand on her back as he moved past her in the kitchen, her fingers brushing his as she handed him coffee. They sat closer together in the evenings, their chairs pulled near enough that their knees touched. One night, Eleanor fell asleep in her chair by the fire. She woke hours later to find herself in her bed, still fully dressed but covered with a blanket. Caleb must have carried her. The thought should have scared her, should have felt like a violation of her space. Instead, it made her feel cared for. The herbs finally sprouted, tiny green shoots pushing up through the dark soil. Eleanor showed Caleb triumphantly one morning, and his smile was genuine. Told you they'd grow, he said, only because I stared at them enough. Must be it. March arrived with the promise of thaw. The days grew noticeably longer. The snow started melting in patches, revealing brown grass underneath. The animals grew restless, sensing spring coming. Eleanor found herself thinking about the future for the first time in years, about what summer would look like here, about planting a real garden, not just herbs in a box, about learning to ride so she could see more of the ranch, about all the seasons she'd spend here with Caleb, learning this life, building something neither of them had ever had before. One evening, she was washing dishes when Caleb came up behind her. Not touching, but close. Eleanor. I've been thinking. She turned to look at him, hands still wet from the dishwater. About what? He seemed uncertain, which was unusual for him. About what you said, after your father left, about wanting to try, about seeing what this could be. Eleanor's heart picked up speed. What about it? I just want you to know that there's no pressure, no timeline. You don't have to figure everything out right now or be sure about anything. We can just keep going like we are, learning each other, building trust. I know that. Good. He paused. But I also want you to know that I'm not just being patient because I'm waiting for something. I'm patient because I want to be, because you're worth being patient for, because it matters to me. You matter to me. Eleanor set down the dish she was holding. You matter to me too. Yeah? Yeah. You scare me sometimes, how much you matter, how much I've started to need this, need you. I've never let myself need anyone before. Caleb stepped closer. It's scary as hell, isn't it? Letting someone in. Terrifying. But worth it. Eleanor thought about the past months, about learning to laugh again, about planting seeds and watching them grow, about standing up to her father with Caleb beside her, about falling asleep by the fire and waking up safe in her own bed. Yes, she said. Worth it. Caleb reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Such a simple gesture, but it made Eleanor's breath catch.
I'm going to kiss you now, he said quietly, if that's all right. Instead of answering, Eleanor rose on her toes and kissed him first. And this time it wasn't brief or uncertain. This time she let herself feel it, let herself want it, let herself believe that this man wasn't going to hurt her. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I've been waiting to do that for months, he admitted. I know, I could tell. Could you? You're not as subtle as you think you are. He laughed quietly. Apparently not. They stood there in the kitchen, dishes forgotten, just holding each other. Outside, the last light of day faded into dusk. Inside, the fire crackled and the herbs grew, and two people who'd once been strangers learned what it meant to choose each other. Caleb? Yeah? When did you know that you wanted this, that you wanted me here? He was quiet for a moment, thinking. Honestly, that day 15 years ago. I know that sounds crazy, I was just a kid. But I remember thinking that if I ever got the chance, I'd build a life good enough to share with someone like you, someone who saw suffering and did something about it, someone kind. I'm not always kind. No one is. But you were when it mattered, and you're stronger than you know. You survived things that should have broken you. That's worth more than being perfect. Eleanor pulled back enough to look at him. I'm never going to be perfect. I'm going to have bad days, days where I can't trust this, days where I pull away or push you out, or I know. And I'll be here anyway. That's what this is. Not perfection, just showing up, every day, even the hard ones. It was such a simple promise, but it was everything Eleanor had never had. Someone who would stay, someone who would show up, someone who chose her not despite her damage, but because he saw past it to who she really was. Okay, she said quietly. Okay. Let's do this, for real. Not just sharing a house or being civil. Let's try to build something real. Caleb's smile could have lit the whole room. I'd like that. They finished the dishes together, working side by side in comfortable silence. And when Eleanor went to bed that night, her door stayed open. And across the house, so did Caleb's. Spring was coming, the herbs were growing, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor Voss believed she might actually have a future worth living. The thaw came slowly, then all at once. One morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of water dripping from the eaves. Not the quiet melt of previous weeks, but a steady stream. She went to the window and saw rivulets running through the snow, carving channels down the mountainside. The world was coming alive again. Caleb was already outside when she emerged from her room, standing on the porch with his coffee, watching the transformation. He glanced back when he heard the door. Spring's here, he said. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. The air smelled different, wetter. The sharp, clean scent of melting snow mixed with something earthier underneath. Feels early, she said. Little bit, but I'm not complaining. He took a sip of his coffee. Means we can start on that garden you've been planning. Eleanor had been planning a garden, sketching it out on scraps of paper at the kitchen table, asking Caleb what grew well at this elevation, what the soil was like, how much sun different areas got. It had started as something to occupy her mind during the long winter evenings, but had become something more, a way of claiming this place as truly hers. I've never grown anything before, she admitted. Not really, just those herbs. You'll figure it out, same as you figured out everything else here. It was true. Eleanor had learned more in the past 4 months than in all her previous years combined. She could split wood now, could read weather patterns, could fix a broken fence rail. She'd learned to shoot Caleb's rifle, though she wasn't particularly good at it yet. She'd learned the names of the cattle, learned which ones were stubborn and which were docile. She'd learned that she was capable of more than survival. She was capable of building something. When should we start? She asked. Soon as the ground's soft enough to turn, maybe a week or two. In the meantime, we should clear that space on the south side, get the rocks out, level it proper. We. He always said we now, never telling her what to do, always including her in the planning and the work. Eleanor had stopped flinching every time she heard it, had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. They worked together that morning, clearing winter debris from around the house.
Broken branches, accumulated leaves, places where snow had damaged things. It was good work, physical and straightforward. By midday, Eleanor's back ached and her hands were dirty, but she felt accomplished. She was washing up for lunch when she realized she was humming. Actually humming. She stopped, surprised at herself, then started again. It was a tune her mother used to sing. Eleanor hadn't thought of it in years. "What's that song?" Caleb asked from the table. "Something my mother knew. I don't even know where she learned it." "It's nice. You have a good voice." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "I don't sing much." "You should. House could use more music." It was such a simple comment, but it settled something in Eleanor's chest. The idea that this house could have music in it, that she could fill it with sounds other than footsteps and quiet conversations, that she was allowed to take up space here, to make noise, to exist loudly if she wanted to. Over the next week, they prepared the garden space. Caleb showed Eleanor how to turn the soil, how to remove rocks without disturbing the good earth underneath. They worked side by side, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Both were comfortable now. Eleanor found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the way his shoulders moved when he worked, the concentration on his face when he was focused on a task, the rare smiles that appeared when something pleased him. She was learning him in ways that went beyond the practical details of sharing a house, and she was letting him learn her, letting him see her frustrated when something didn't work, letting him see her laugh at small absurdities, letting him see her cry when she found a bird's nest that hadn't survived the winter, the tiny eggs cracked and empty. "Nature's cruel sometimes," Caleb had said gently, taking the nest from her hands. "I know, I just hate it." "Me too." He'd buried the nest under a tree, and Eleanor had appreciated that he hadn't made her feel foolish for caring about something so small. By late March, the garden space was ready. Caleb brought home seed packets from a trip to the nearest supply post, a place called Henderson's Store, about 15 miles south. Eleanor spread them out on the kitchen table like treasures. Tomatoes, beans, carrots, lettuce, peas, squash, even some flower seeds, sunflowers and black-eyed Susans. "You bought flowers," she said, looking up at him. Caleb shrugged, but she could see the pleased expression on his face. "Thought they'd look nice near the porch, if you want them." Eleanor picked up the packet of sunflower seeds, turning it over in her hands. "I want them." They planted the next day. Caleb showed her how to make rows, how deep to plant different seeds, how to space them properly. Eleanor's hands worked the soil, pressing seeds into the earth, covering them gently. It felt sacred somehow, like a promise she was making to the future. This garden would need tending all summer, would need her here, present, committed. She was planting evidence that she intended to stay. When they finished, Eleanor stood back and looked at the neat rows of turned earth. Nothing to see yet, just dirt and hope. But she felt it anyway, the beginning of something. That evening, she found Caleb in the barn, checking on a cow that was close to calving. Eleanor leaned against the stall door, watching him work. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always." "Do you ever regret it, the way you went about this? Lying to my father, manipulating the situation. Do you ever wish you'd done it differently?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, his hand still on the cow's flank. "Sometimes. I wish I'd given you a real choice. Wish I'd been honest from the start. But do I regret getting you out of that house? No. Never. Even if I'd said no? If I'd refused to stay? Even then, at least you'd have been free to choose." Eleanor considered that. "I don't think I could have chosen. Not then. I was too scared. Too convinced I deserved what I had." Caleb looked at her over the cow's back. "And now? Now I know better. Now I know I deserved more than I ever let myself want." "We all do," Caleb said quietly. "Most people just never figure that out." The cow lowed softly, shifting in the straw. Caleb returned his attention to her, but Eleanor stayed, thinking about his words, about all the years she'd spent believing she was too much and not enough all at once, about how Caleb had seen something different, had seen someone worth building a life for. The calf came 2 days later. Eleanor watched from the barn door as Caleb helped the mother through the birth, his hands sure and gentle. When the calf finally emerged, slick and wobbling, Eleanor felt tears on her face.
It's beautiful, she said. Caleb glanced back at her, smiling. Life usually is, when you let yourself see it. Eleanor thought about that constantly in the weeks that followed, about seeing life, really seeing it, instead of just surviving it. She'd spent so long in survival mode that she'd forgotten what it meant to actually live. But here, on Blackwood Ridge, she was learning. She was learning that mornings could be peaceful instead of tense, that meals could be enjoyed instead of endured, that work could be satisfying instead of just necessary, that another person's presence could be comforting instead of threatening. She was learning that she could laugh without waiting for punishment, could express opinions without fear of consequences, could make mistakes without bracing for violence. She was learning to be a person instead of a shell. The first sprouts appeared in early April, tiny green shoots pushing up through the dark soil. Eleanor checked them obsessively, just like she had with the herbs. Caleb teased her about it, but gently. "They're going to grow whether you watch them or not," he said one morning, finding her kneeling in the garden before breakfast. "I know, but I like watching them." He crouched beside her, examining the sprouts. "Beans are doing well, and look, there's your first sunflower." Eleanor saw it, a tiny pair of leaves, distinctive in shape. Her sunflower. She'd planted it herself. "It's really growing," she said, hearing the wonder in her own voice. "Did you doubt it would?" "Maybe a little." Caleb looked at her and his expression was soft. "You doubted a lot of things when you got here, but they all grew anyway. The herbs, the garden, you." Eleanor met his eyes. "I'm still growing." "I know, so am I." They stayed there in the garden together, watching the morning sun climb over the mountains, and Eleanor felt something settle deep in her bones. This was home. Not just the house or the land, but this. These quiet moments with someone who saw her clearly and chose to stay anyway. Later that week, Eleanor was cleaning out her dresser when she found the carved sparrow. She'd tucked it away weeks ago, not wanting to lose it again. But now she took it out and turned it over in her hands. 15 years Caleb had kept this. 15 years he'd remembered her. She found him outside, repairing a section of fence that had come loose during the thaw. "I need to tell you something," she said. Caleb looked up, setting down his hammer. "All right." Eleanor held out the sparrow. "I've been thinking about this. About what it means that you kept it. About what it meant to you." "Eleanor, you don't have to..." "Let me finish." She took a breath. "I gave you bread because I saw you were hungry. That's all. I didn't do it expecting anything. Didn't do it thinking about who you were or who you'd become. I was 8 years old and someone was starving in front of me. I know that. But you turned it into something bigger. You spent 15 years building toward this moment, building a life you thought would be worthy of that small kindness. And I need you to know something." She stepped closer. "It was already worthy. You were already worthy. You didn't have to earn the right to be treated like a human being, Caleb. You had that right all along." Caleb's throat worked. "I'm not sure I believe that. I know. Just like I'm not sure I believe I deserve to be rescued from my father's house. We're both carrying things that tell us we're not enough, that we have to earn basic decency and kindness." She reached out and took his hand. "But maybe we can believe it for each other, even if we can't believe it for ourselves yet." Caleb's fingers closed around hers, holding tight. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just tired of being afraid." He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. Eleanor leaned into him, breathing in the smell of sawdust and sun-warmed cotton. This was becoming familiar, his embrace, his steadiness, his presence. She was learning to crave it instead of fear it. "I want to marry you," she said into his chest. Caleb went still. "We are married. I know, but I want to marry you for real, not because I was trapped, not because there were no other options. I want to choose you, deliberately, with full knowledge of what I'm doing." Caleb pulled back enough to look at her face. "Eleanor, I know it sounds crazy. We're already legally married, but that ceremony in Dry Creek, that wasn't real. I was terrified. I felt like property being transferred. I want to do it again, here, just us, the way it should have been." "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Caleb searched her face for a long moment. Then he smiled, slow and genuine. "All right, then let's do it right." That evening, Caleb disappeared into his room for a while. When he came out, he was holding something small. He sat down at the table across from Eleanor. "I made something," he said. "During the blizzard, while you were sleeping, wasn't sure I'd ever give it to you, but I wanted it to exist, just in case." He opened his hand. In his palm sat a ring. Not metal, but wood, carved from dark pine, smooth and simple. The wood was almost black, polished to a soft shine. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed. "It's not much. I know most women want gold or silver, something valuable. It's perfect." Eleanor picked it up, feeling the weight of it. Light but solid, made by his hands, made for her. "When did you make this?" "During the worst of the storm, when I thought we might not make it through. I wanted to make something that said what I couldn't say out loud. That you mattered. That I'd choose you every day if you'd let me." Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes. "I'd let you. I am letting you." "Then wear it, if you want to." Eleanor slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like he'd somehow known exactly what size to make it. She looked at her hand, at this simple wooden band that meant more than any expensive jewelry ever could. "I don't have anything to give you," she said. "You're here, that's enough." But Eleanor shook her head. "No. If we're doing this right, then I'm giving you something too. Wait here." She went to her room and came back with something small clenched in her fist. She sat down and held out her hand, opening it. The carved sparrow sat in her palm. "This is yours," she said. "It was always yours. You kept it for 15 years when you should have forgotten about it. When you should have moved on and built a life without looking back. But you didn't. You held on to this tiny reminder that kindness existed in the world. So I'm giving it back to you. Not because I don't want it, but because it belongs to you. Because it represents something about who you are, not just what I did." Caleb's hand shook slightly as he took the sparrow. "Eleanor, keep it. Remember that you're worth remembering, that you always were." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, each holding the gift the other had given. The evening light slanted through the windows, turning everything golden. "So how do we do this?" Eleanor asked. "How do we marry ourselves?" Caleb thought for a moment. "I guess we just say what we mean, make promises we intend to keep, witness it ourselves since there's no one else here to do it. No preacher, no crowd, just us. Just us." Eleanor took a breath. "All right, I'll go first." She looked at Caleb, really looked at him. At this man who'd seen her at her worst and stayed, who'd been patient when she needed patience and pushed when she needed pushing, who'd built her a home before she knew she needed one. "Caleb Mercer," she began, and her voice only shook a little. "I came to this ridge broken and scared, convinced I was worth nothing, convinced I deserved the cruelty I'd been shown. You didn't try to fix me. You didn't try to save me like I was some helpless thing. You just gave me space to figure out who I was when I wasn't being hurt. You gave me room to grow." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm not going to promise to be perfect. I'm going to have bad days. I'm going to pull away sometimes. I'm going to doubt this and doubt myself. But I promise to keep trying. I promise to show up. I promise to plant seeds and tend them and believe in spring even when winter feels endless. I promise to choose you every day for as long as I'm breathing." Caleb's eyes were bright. He cleared his throat roughly. "Eleanor Voss, or Mercer now, I guess. I spent 15 years preparing for you without knowing if I'd ever see you again. Built this ranch. Built this house. Built a life I thought might be worth offering to someone who saw the world the way you did. Someone who saw suffering and did something about it." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "I won't promise to be perfect either. I'm stubborn. I get quiet when I should talk. I hold on to things too long. But I promise to be honest. I promise to be patient. I promise to stand beside you, not in front of you, when things get hard. I promise to see you, really see you, not some idealized version from memory, but the real you, complicated and strong and still healing. And I promise to choose you right back, every single day." Eleanor felt tears running down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. Let them fall. Let herself feel everything. "Is that it then?" she asked. "Are we married?" "I think we've been married for a while now. Just took us time to catch up to it." Eleanor laughed through her tears. "We should seal it somehow. Make it official." "How?"
She stood up and walked around the table. Caleb turned in his chair to face her. Eleanor took his face in her hands and kissed him. Not the careful, tentative kisses they'd shared before. This was different. This was a promise. This was choosing him deliberately, with full knowledge, with hope instead of fear. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said quietly. "I know I haven't said it before. Didn't want to pressure you, but I do. I love you." Eleanor's breath caught. 3 words she'd never heard directed at her. 3 words she'd convinced herself she didn't need or deserve. 3 words that terrified her and healed her all at once. "I love you too," she whispered back. "I think I have for a while. I was just too scared to name it." They held each other in the kitchen of the house Caleb had built for her, wearing rings they'd made and given to each other, and Eleanor felt something fundamental shift inside her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, really, truly living. The days that followed were both the same and completely different. They still woke early and worked hard and fell into bed exhausted at the end of each day. But now there was an ease between them that hadn't existed before. A certainty. Eleanor moved her things into Caleb's room, not all at once, but gradually. A dress here, a brush there, until one day she realized she was sleeping in his bed every night and her old room stood empty. "What should we do with it?" she asked one morning, standing in the doorway of the room that had been hers. Caleb came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Whatever you want. Storage. Guest room if we ever have guests. Or we could leave it empty. Keep it as a reminder of where you started." Eleanor leaned back against him. "I don't need reminders. I was thinking we could make it into something else. Something forward-looking instead of backward-looking." "Like what?" Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "Maybe a nursery? Eventually, if that's something you want." Caleb's expression went very still. "Is that something you want?" "I don't know yet. Maybe. Someday. When I'm ready. When we're ready." She looked up at him. "I never let myself think about children before. Never let myself want them because I was so scared I'd become my father. But you're not him, and I'm not him, and maybe we could do better." "We would do better," Caleb said firmly. "We already are." Eleanor smiled. "So we'll leave it empty for now, but maybe not forever." Maybe not forever. The garden grew. The seedlings became plants stretching toward the sun. Eleanor tended them daily, pulling weeds, checking for pests, watering during dry spells. It was meditative work. Gave her time to think, to process, to just exist in the moment. The sunflowers grew fastest. By late May, they were knee-high, their broad leaves reaching out. By June, they were taller than Eleanor. She'd planted them near the porch, just like Caleb had suggested, and they transformed the front of the house, made it look lived in and loved. One morning in early July, Eleanor woke before dawn. She slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Caleb, and went outside. The air was cool and fresh, the sky just starting to lighten in the east. She walked to the garden and stood among the growing things. The tomatoes were setting fruit. The beans were climbing their poles. The carrots were somewhere underground, growing in the dark. And the sunflowers stood like sentinels, their faces still closed, waiting for the sun. Eleanor thought about the woman who'd stood in a church in Dry Creek 5 months ago. That woman had been a ghost, barely existing, convinced she had no future worth living. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone Eleanor was still getting to know. Someone capable and strong. Someone who could plant seeds and believe they'd grow. Someone who could love and be loved. Someone who was building a life instead of just enduring one. The sun broke over the eastern mountains, flooding the valley with golden light. The sunflowers began to open, turning their faces toward the warmth. Eleanor watched them, transfixed. "They're blooming." She turned. Caleb stood on the porch, his hair messy from sleep, watching her. "I know. I wanted to see it happen." He came down the steps and crossed to where she stood. Together they watched the sunflowers open fully, their bright yellow petals unfurling. "Beautiful," Caleb said. "They really are." "I was talking about you." Eleanor looked at him and saw the truth of it in his face. He thought she was beautiful. Not despite everything she'd been through, but because of it, because she'd survived and grown and bloomed anyway. "I'm happy," she said, surprised by the realization. "I don't think I've ever been happy before." Not really, but I am now. Good. You deserve to be. So do you. Caleb pulled her close. They stood in the garden they'd planted together, surrounded by growing things, and watched the sun climb higher. The mountains rose up on all sides, eternal and indifferent. But here, in this small valley, two people had built something that mattered. They'd built a home. Not just a house, but a real home. The kind of place where you could be yourself, whatever that meant. The kind of place where you could make mistakes and learn and grow. The kind of place where love wasn't something you had to earn, but something freely given and freely received. Eleanor thought about her father sometimes, wondered if he was still in Dry Creek, still gambling, still drinking himself into oblivion. She didn't hate him anymore, didn't love him either. He was just a man who'd been hurt and had hurt others in turn. A cautionary tale about what happened when you let pain consume you instead of learning from it. She'd chosen differently, had chosen to let Caleb help her heal, had chosen to believe in spring even when winter felt endless, had chosen to plant seeds and trust they'd grow. And they had. Everything had grown. The garden, the ranch, the tentative connection between her and Caleb that had deepened into something solid and real. Her own sense of self, fragile at first but getting stronger every day. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked. "Everything, nothing. How different things are now compared to 5 months ago." "Better different?" "So much better it's almost hard to believe." Caleb kissed the top of her head. "Believe it. This is real. We're real." Eleanor turned in his arms and looked up at him. This man who'd waited 15 years for her, who'd seen her at her worst and had stayed, who'd built her a home and then given her the space to decide if she wanted to fill it. "I know," she said. "I finally know." They went inside together to start their day, made coffee and breakfast, and talked about what needed doing. The fence in the north pasture needed mending. The barn roof still leaked in one corner. The chickens were acting strange, might be a fox around. Normal, everyday concerns. The kind of problems that came with building a life. Eleanor had learned to love these problems. They meant she had something to protect, something worth the effort. That evening, after chores were done and dinner was eaten and the sun was setting in shades of orange and pink, they sat together on the porch. The same porch where Eleanor had first arrived, cold and scared and convinced this was just another prison. Now it felt like the opposite, like freedom. "Caleb?" "Thank you." He looked at her puzzled. "For what?" "For remembering, for keeping the sparrow, for building all of this, for seeing something in me worth waiting for." Caleb took her hand, his thumb brushing over the wooden ring she wore. "Thank you for giving a starving boy bread, for being kind when you didn't have to be, for staying even when you were scared, for choosing this, choosing me." "Choosing us," Eleanor corrected. "Choosing us," he agreed. They sat together as darkness fell over Blackwood Ridge. The stars came out, brilliant and infinite. The mountains stood silent watch. And in the small house that love had built, two people who'd once been broken learned what it meant to be whole. Not perfect, never perfect. Both of them still carried scars. Both of them still had hard days. But they carried them together now, shared the weight, reminded each other that they were worth more than their worst moments, that they deserved kindness and patience and love. Eleanor thought about the little girl who'd given bread to a stranger, thought about how that single act of kindness had rippled forward through 15 years and had brought her to this moment, to this man, to this life. Maybe that was the truth underneath everything. That kindness mattered. That seeing someone suffering and doing something about it, however small, could change the course of a life, could plant seeds that took years to grow but bloomed into something beautiful when they finally did. She looked at Caleb, at the man who'd proven that patience was possible, that people could change, that home wasn't a place but a feeling you built with someone who saw you clearly and chose to stay. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." Simple words, true words, the kind of words that didn't need elaborate speeches or dramatic gestures. Just two people sitting together, meaning what they said. The sunflowers would bloom all summer. The garden would produce food for their table. The ranch would demand constant work and attention. Winter would come again eventually, harsh and unforgiving. But Eleanor wasn't afraid anymore. She had Caleb. She had this life they'd built together. She had the knowledge that she was strong enough to survive anything because she'd already survived the worst. And more than that, she had hope. Real hope. The kind that came from planting seeds in the dark earth and believing they would grow. The kind that came from loving someone who loved you back without conditions or demands. The kind that came from finally understanding that you were neither too much nor too little. You were exactly enough. Exactly right. Exactly where you were meant to be. Eleanor leaned against Caleb's shoulder and watched the stars wheel overhead. The Montana sky stretched vast and endless above them, full of possibilities they hadn't yet imagined. But they had time. All the time in the world. They had seasons ahead of them, summers and winters, harvests and storms, difficulties and triumphs, all of it waiting to be lived, together. And for Eleanor Mercer, who had once been Eleanor Voss, who had once been a frightened girl who'd given bread to a starving boy, that was more than enough. It was everything.